Okay, so today's video is going to go over the Constitutional Convention, which is something you've read about in your textbook and have probably talked about in the past. And we're going to discuss the main issues, the who, the what, the where, the when, the why, and the how, the big debates that occurred during the Constitutional Convention. So what was it? It was a meeting of delegates from across the country, from different states, the purpose of which was to revise the Articles of Confederation. So here's your revision pen. And why was it called? As you've read, the Articles of Confederation had a whole bunch of problems, and it turned out that it simply was not a document that created a strong enough federal government. And Shays' Rebellion really highlighted this point, that we needed to have someone who was, or a central government that was stronger than perhaps the Articles allowed them to be. This slide here really runs down a whole series of the weaknesses with the Articles of Confederation. Congress was not allowed to force states to send soldiers to the military. Congress could not regulate commerce. There was no interstate commerce clause. Congress could not enforce its treaties, even though they could write them. They could not directly tax. They had no enforcement mechanisms. 9 states had to approve any law that was passed out of the 13 states. All amendments had to have a unanimous decision from the 13 states. There was no judicial court system, and there was no executive branch. So these are the main problems that the Articles of Confederation had. So when was it? It was in the summer of 1787, famous for being a very, very hot summer and a very hot convention. It was in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. And as far as who attended, 55 delegates attended the convention from 12 out of the 13 states. Rhode Island refused to send delegates. Perhaps they were pleased with the Articles of Confederation. They were a small state, so perhaps they weren't interested in reforming them. Many of the delegates were quite young. Some of them were in their 20s. We called them founding fathers, and yet they were only in their 20s. So young fathers, certainly. They weren't the old statesmen that we often think of them, or many of them anyway. Many of them owned slaves. And the questions we need to ask ourselves, and we will as we move forward, are what were their real motivations? What did they hope to accomplish by this? Notable delegates: George Washington from Virginia. He ended up being the presiding officer, and obviously he was a well-respected war hero from the Revolutionary War. We also had James Madison, also from Virginia. He was a wealthy planter from Virginia. He was a member of the Virginia government, and he strongly believed that we needed a strong central government. Madison actually recorded a lot of what happened at the convention, and we get a lot of our information about the debates that occurred here from Madison's notes. Also, Alexander Hamilton from New York. He was another proponent of a strong federal government, and he was one of the people who organized the convention. And we also, of course, had Benjamin Franklin, one of the elder statesmen, 81 years old, and he had a lot of experience and had been throughout the previous decades an American leader. Might be worth noting that Thomas Jefferson and John Adams were not at the Constitutional Convention, and both of them were in Europe at the time. So we've gone over some of the background of where it was and why it was called. Perhaps more importantly, we need to talk about the plans that were developed at the Constitutional Convention and the debates that ensued. So the first plan that you need to be familiar with, the Virginia Plan, was supposed to completely scrap the Articles of Confederation, create a strong federal government that could make up for those shortcomings that the Articles had. It could impose taxes, it could regulate trade, and it had an enforcement mechanism. They wanted to divide the government into 3 branches: legislative, executive, and judicial. Note the Articles of Confederation didn't have an executive, didn't have a federal judiciary, so the Virginia Plan would make up for these deficits. The legislature would be divided into 2 houses, and each state would be represented by the proportion of its population in both houses. So both houses, you would have a number of representatives depending on your population and the size of the state. The first house would be elected by state voters, and the second house would be elected by the first house, and this plan was proposed by James Madison, or at least he was the chief architect of it. The New Jersey Plan was an opposing plan to the Virginia Plan, and it was supported by the smaller states. because the Virginia plan had two houses that both were determined in size based on state population. Smaller states felt that they would have less of a voice under a new constitution under the Virginia plan than they would under the Articles of Confederation. So the New Jersey plan was less of a departure from the Articles of Confederation. They still wanted a stronger central government, and they still wanted three different branches, but they wanted a one-house legislature, so only one house, and then representation would be equal for every state. So every state would have the same power in Congress. So Congress, the Constitutional Convention would move forward with the Virginia plan and saying that we wanted two houses, but they eventually realized that in order to get a workable document that would have enough support from the 13 states, they needed a compromise. That compromise was known as the Connecticut Compromise, or we also call it the Great Compromise, which basically combined the two plans. Keep the two-house legislature of the Virginia plan, but make one of those houses based on population. The lower house, the House of Representatives, would be based on population and would be elected by state voters. And then the upper house would have equal representation for each state, and those representatives, the Senate, in the Senate would be elected by state legislatures. So they keep key elements of both plans. And another significant compromise that is certainly worth noting, and obviously becomes a point of contention as our country moves forward throughout history, is the Three-Fifths Compromise, where southern states, when it came to counting population and apportioning representation in the new Congress, southern states wanted to count slaves as part of their regular population. However, northern states, which at the time had far fewer slaves, disagreed with this because they thought that slaves could not vote and were considered property and therefore shouldn't be counted when determining representation. So this compromise, this inhumane compromise, was to count slaves as 3/5 of a person when determining state representation. Certainly this is a strange way of looking at how to count individual people. But the institution of slavery certainly complicated many things when it came to the Constitutional Convention and drafting documents. So certainly things to remember that we've talked about so far are the Virginia Plan, the New Jersey Plan, the Great Compromise, and the Three-Fifths Compromise. But your textbook, when talking about the Constitution, and after they've discussed the convention itself and the debates that occurred there, they really identify three key principles that the document that emerged from the convention highlighted or had within it. So I want to talk about those three key principles and add a fourth. So there are four real key founding principles or identifying concepts to the U.S. Constitution that was created during the Constitutional Convention that you need to be familiar with. So the first of these concepts is federalism. And federalism is the division of power between the national government and the state governments. And under a federal system, you have a national government which has specific powers and a state government which has specific powers, and then also both governments have powers that they share, or these are what are called concurrent powers. So this is a really, really important concept, and it's part of the separation of powers of the United States. And the separation of powers is really the second key concept. So one, you have a separation of powers between state and federal government, but within the federal government you have separate powers between three branches: the executive branch, the legislative branch, and the judicial branch. So that is a second key principle of the Constitution, and really is foundational to how our government operates. So with separation of powers, you have three branches that have unique powers, but the third key principle is the concept of checks and balances. So each of the three branches are able to limit one another, and they're able to have checks, if you will, on the other branch. And there's a whole chart here listing them, and we'll be talking about the different ways that different branches can limit the power or influence of the other two branches. And finally, a key principle is the principle of republicanism. And this is the idea that our representatives will be chosen by the people, and in a republican form of government, individual voters choose representatives, and those representatives then pass laws and make policy. So it's not pure democracy, because not every individual is voting on every issue, but it is democratic, and it really allows for a calibrated popular input in which input is given, but it is filtered through a representative system. So as a summary for this lesson, we talked about the Constitutional Convention, where it was, why it was called, and who was there. We talked about the key proposals and compromises that were made within the convention, and then the founding document that emerged from it with its key principles, which we will be talking about in class in much greater detail.